Hi everyone, I'm Alex, and my co-host Trey could not be with us today, so it'll just be me and our guest Jodie. Jodie is a brain surgery survivor who, after having some surgery done on his amygdala, has had some interesting side effects to his surgery, which include a loss of some sort of like more primal senses of fear. So it should be interesting to talk to him and see how his life has changed since his surgery.
Hello.
Hi there, Jodie. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So to kick things off, we'll just start off with you introducing yourself and just sort of your life and your background as much as you're comfortable sharing that led up to this surgery.
Oh, well, that's a long story if we want to go over my life. I have like a list. Generally like to bullet point the tragic history of Jodie Smith. I'm currently in my where in the apartment I was literally born in. I was born 20 feet that way and in the central New York City. And I don't know, had an interesting upbringing. My dad died when I was 13, brother died when I was 17, hepatitis and cancer, all sorts of random stuff, lots of death in my family.
Mm.
And some might link that to why I was especially scared of death. I didn't feel a direct connection, but there's an intuitive connection there. And then, I don't know, kind of messed around with my life, tried to become a pilot. I dropped out of college to try to become a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And when I realized that being a professional pilot sucks, I went back to college.
I gotcha. What sucked about it? Just boring?
It costs a lot of money to become a pilot, and then you don't get paid very much for the first 5-10 years. And the job during that time isn't good or fun. And I like flying airplanes. I don't like pressing buttons and watching the clouds go by.
Right.
So it's kind of like I realized I developed a passion for motorcycles, so I'm going to become a bus driver. No, that's kind of the thing that I didn't really think about at 19, thinking I'm going to do what I love and never work a day in my life. I was totally wrong. And luckily turned away from that. Started going to school for computer science and building my own airplane. And about 80% of the way through it, I had my first seizure.
Mm-hmm. What was that like?
So it's interesting. I had 6 months of having seizures when I didn't know I was having seizures. The feeling was, I can describe the sensation using contexts that weren't included in. So imagine you're about to walk out the door. You just look at, oh, did I forget my keys? Oh, that sort of is something wrong feeling, a little bit like if you're an animal, your ears would go up.
Right. Sort of that nagging, maybe semi-conscious feeling of something's wrong.
Yeah. And then the feeling that comes up with finding out something's really wrong, as in oh man, I just found out my grandma died, or I just found out I have some disease, something bad just happened. Those two emotions accompanied by that sort of fight or flight, senses are tuned. I'm something around me. Percussive noises would be especially powerful, almost like the sound of something threatening is nearby. I wasn't actually scared. This would happen while I was driving, and I'd just be weird, I'm feeling this way. It must be anxiety. I'm drinking too much coffee, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
6 months of those, and I have a really big seizure where I still don't convulse, but I have a 20-minute gap in memory while my brain was having a seizure, where I just walked around aimlessly, and I started stumbling, and eventually a neighbor was called the cops. It was my grandma's neighbor, thinking there's some drunk guy in her backyard.
Yeah.
But EMTs show up, and a week later diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy.
Okay. Yeah. When you're describing these fight or flight responses, and you think that possibly it is anxiety, is it similar to a panic attack?
Yes, it's actually, if I had gone to the doctor with those first sets of symptoms, a neuropsychiatrist would say you're having a panic attack. 90% of the time, the series of sensations I have are panic attacks. It's because it's activating the same part of the brain. I just happen to have really small seizures right where panic attacks are in the brain as well, where the activity of a panic attack is.
Mm-hmm.
It's activating the same pathways.
Yeah, I got you. I mean, I've never experienced a seizure, but I had my first true panic attack about a year ago. And it's one of the freakiest sensations of this fight or flight, and just this like super tight feeling. Like I thought maybe I was having a heart attack. But yeah, if those are similar, and I've heard seizures described as sort of electrical storms in your brain. Is that true? I'm not really sure of like the technical description of a seizure.
So consciousness in the brain works in a very set of organized activity. Every pattern represents, like, if you have activity in this part of your brain, it's because you're seeing something that way. If you have activity here, because you're recognizing something you see, but whereas seizures just chaotic, and it depends on the size of the seizure. Some could definitely, like, you could say that your brain's always an electrical storm, but it's a matter of how organized it is. And an important part of the seizure is neurons are supposed to be able to decide to stop firing. The seizure, it just keeps firing and doesn't stop. And that causes, actually, over time, that causes damage to the neurons themselves. But yeah, it's a storm isn't too wrong if you don't,
Right.
it's not wrong at all. It's just a matter of like how different it is than the regular storm we have in our brain.
Right. That's a fair point. Yeah, you're definitely right that there is a continuous, there's something going on in the brain. Well, so after this first incident happens where you have this 20-minute gap in your memory, what ensued after that?
So I was taken to a hospital that didn't have the proper machinery they didn't have an MRI or anything to check what's going on, but they were able to CAT scan me and say it wasn't a stroke. Yay, good job.
Nice.
But a week later, I go to a hospital that does have that stuff, and they ask me if I can. Some doctor had implied that those little panic attack moments are probably seizures, and so they asked, "Can you demonstrate a seizure?" And I was like, "Yeah." I knew that sleep deprivation would trigger those, so I was spending 3 days in the hospital bed. They told me to trigger a seizure. I said, okay. So I turn on Skrillex and take like a drink of 5 Hour Energy,
Oh,
stay up all night, like literally with headphones on, trying to give myself a seizure, and it worked. I was able to give myself like a dozen of those little ones over that 3 days.
oh wow.
And they were very confident that they were seizures, diagnosed me with epilepsy, and said, take this medication, hopefully we'll control it. And then from there, I tried about 4 different medications. Maybe technically I'm on my 5th now, and none of them worked all the way. Like I went from having 3 seizures a day to having 3 a week, and they were looking for none a year, like 0. So even though that felt like progress to me, it was still going to like potentially kill me, but definitely get worse over time. So they made the call, since it was a very small focus, to cut it out.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sort of premonition that these are coming? Like I know I had a professor that she has epilepsy, and she feels these sort of auras when these incidents are about to happen. Does that happen for you, or is it totally out of the blue?
Well, what those auras are actually seizures that are before it becomes big. I was basically just having the premonitions, the auras. So my whole experience, other than that 20-minute one, was the aura. I was lucky not to have more generalized seizures. I never convulsed. I only lost awareness the one time. Never completely went, out.
Mm-hmm.
Just the gap in memory and some discoordinated movement.
Right. And so when did the surgical procedure happen in relation to these incidents? Was that later down the road, or was that shortly after these medications weren't cutting it for you?
They gave the medications about a year. And so it was like July 2016 was my diagnosis. And then by February 2018, I was my first appointment for brain surgery. So they went quickly because of like it's not every epileptic has such a convenient place to cut out. If I'd had seizures in my frontal lobe, left temporal lobe, occipital lobe, they would have been a lot more nervous because that cuts out daily functions. Whereas cutting out the right side, if like really almost like cutting out half of a right temporal lobe, no one would know that I'm missing 10% of my brain. Like I have to tell people if I want them to know. And so, yeah, they were aggressive. They described like, technically we could probably cut out like half of what we're cutting out, but you'll be fine. Let's take it out and make sure you don't have seizures.
Right. Yeah. And I read sort of your own risk analysis going in. I think
Yeah.
you had written that, oh, going in, you're going to go under. You are basically definitely going to wake up, and there's maybe like a 1% chance of like hemorrhaging or
Oh
having
yeah.
some sort of something like that. So going in, were you not really concerned with what was happening, despite
Well,
your fear of death?
right now, I was so surprised that I wasn't scared, and the moments leading up to it, I was pretty, but I describe it as the feeling of being on like a water slide and a log where they'll just, you got to hold on and that's what's going to happen. It's going to happen. But leading up to it though, I was aware of like so much risk that I spent more money than I had taking my then girlfriend and I to the Grand Canyon, because I'd never been there.
Right.
Went there for a week, just loaded up a credit card, said I might not be able, like I was aware that I might not be able to see coming out of it, might not be able to talk,
Ah,
might not be able to walk. Um, so in the 1% was a pretty big chance. I was certainly nervous about it, but I was so confident in the decision. I think that's probably why and I was confident in the surgeon. The surgeon himself was very well respected across multiple institutions.
yeah. I mean, that has to be a crazy time. I mean, even if there is a 1% chance of something happening, I mean, being the individual going into that situation, you can't get that out of your mind, especially someone who has anxious thoughts centered around death and whatnot.
Yeah, I almost want to say that the reason I wasn't scared then was the same reason I wasn't scared jumping out of an airplane or all the other risky things that I did, is because I made the decision.
Mm.
I think the control of being able to weigh the risks and knowing all the variables and making the decision, I wasn't as scared as like the idea that, okay, like you will inevitably die in 3 years. I'd be terrified, or you will get that. That is really what scared me. I wasn't scared of taking calculated risks back then.
Right. Yeah. If you had one of those magical death clock type
Right.
websites so that would tell you with certainty when you're going to die, you wouldn't go near that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I would, I'd probably go there, but I would still be terrified by it.
Yeah, I'd
I
do the
would
same
just,
thing. I would regret it, but I would have to look at it and I'd be like,
although I think I would actually enjoy it because then I can take more risks, right? Like,
oh, right. Yeah, it's like, well, then I am going to die. Well, I can do anything leading up to that. Well, so you've actually been skydiving. I assume that's what you're doing, jumping out of a plane.
yeah, skydiving, hang gliding, bungee jumping, lots of risky behavior like that some people would be scared of, that I would, I'd look into the risks, be like, oh, 1 in 2 million jumps, have an accident, but it's not generally with students. Why not? And I was building and flying an experimental airplane, like I mentioned, and I had been flying for a while by then. And some people who would like see a picture of the plane I was flying, like there's no cockpit, it's just open, and
Ah,
it looks like a Vespa with wings basically, and it's
hmm.
it was, some people would not choose to go in that, and I very much enjoyed flying that more than the safer feeling planes. Not because it was more dangerous, it was lighter and therefore the handling was more enjoyable for me. Being able to fly low and slow was my pleasure.
Right. And wait, so all of this is pre-surgery?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So even before you sort of felt this alleviation from some degree of fear, you were still taking these calculated risks.
Yeah, I would say like there was never a point where I was fearful of taking calculated risks. I was always an adventurous person. I was never like, it was the fear of death though, it's maybe not let me describe how extreme it was. Like I could be in math class thinking, all right, so x equals 2 y, I'm gonna die one day, equals 7, I'm gonna die one day. And
Hmm.
I would be really really upset about it, like for a whole day. And I would know, like I would know that it wasn't logical for me to think that, and I'd be frustrated with myself, but still like thinking maybe if I just like live to be like 120, I'll make it till there's like some sort of longevity drugs that'll keep me alive forever.
Yeah, that's possible. You could live To a point where we have immortality, to where we could put our consciousness in new bodies, or I don't know, maybe the expansion of the universe reverts and you kind of exist forever. You just rewind and you're born again.
I would try to rationalize all of those things. I'd go through every option, and then I'd find ways to like get myself to not like it. I was like, okay, so what if I had a plan? Okay, I'll get eaten by a single other animal, and then I'll be a part of that animal. But I was like, well, no, I don't like rearranging my consciousness. Doesn't mean that I'm me again. It's like, okay, so there's the Black Mirror episode where you put your consciousness in like a digital form. I was like, that's not me. That's just a copy of my. That's not me. That's a
Right.
copy of me. That doesn't count. And the whole, yeah.
Yeah, well, I really understand why this sort of crisis, this issue revolving around your consciousness, your identity, I could understand why that would become sort of worsened by having this procedure where a part of you is essentially removed. A part of you that some people conclude is you, or maybe is just a major part of you. I mean, was that something you struggled with after this surgery?
Funny that you would say it struggled with it. I definitely like spoke. So not 1 week after surgery, I had a little epiphany where it was like, well, so I mean, going into it, I was definitely thinking about, am I going to still be me? How, like, if I'm my brain, am I going to still be me? Coming out of it, I was like, what? What? Who am I? And the answer is not Jean Valjean, but like, it's
Hmm.
I'm so the no matter what the answer was, I came to the conclusion that that whatever it is doesn't change when I die. It's like, and when like I go to sleep, I wake up, there's a gap in consciousness. I cut out my brain, I still feel like me. So like, is that little version of is that little piece of my brain me? I actually have a separate piece of my brain that's cut out from the rest of the brain, but still being fed like glucose and blood, so it's still alive. So I call it Alcatraz because it's the bad part of the brain when it's separate from the rest.
Oh, I got you. Wait, so where's Alcatraz located? Is that so
Oh,
is it still inside of your head or is it somewhere else?
yeah, so they cut out one big piece. That's not Alcatraz. They threw that out, or they did scientific studies. They, gave it some. They got to electrocute it back on my behalf. But the Alcatraz is inside my brain still. It was a part they were intending to cut out, but it was very, very nestled into blood vessels, and they were like, "Well, it's cut away from the rest of the brain, so we'll leave it in. Let's not cause a hemorrhage." So I have a little second brain going on that receives no sensory input, but it's
Oh,
technically in a coma, as he put it, but like it's there, and it's like,
wow.
is that having dreams? Is that having thoughts?
That's a very interesting, I don't quite want to call it a dilemma, but just an aspect of your life that definitely cuts into sort of the core question. I'm not, have you heard of like the hard problem of consciousness? Just as essentially one of the biggest philosophical, and definitely it has a lot to do with science. Also a very scientific question, is just sort of like, what is consciousness itself? Materialists would believe that we're purely biological. We're just these electric storms, as we call them, composes the human experience. And there are people that believe that like the human spirit or consciousness is somehow external or like additional. Do you have any sort of angle on that?
Very much. Now that's actually the insight that I'm really glad to have, because if I really that was the epiphany I had within a week or two of coming out of brain surgery, because I was able to sort of think. I guess I'll trace back my thought process. I wrote about 2,000 words on it, but I just watching some random show that references life starts with a single cell. Something I'm like, oh, okay, sure, that's happened ancient times. First cell in the world, and we're all
Right.
descendants of the single cell. Sure. When did that develop an individual consciousness? I start traveling through a problem that lots of questions that have been asked many times. But what I couldn't come to the conclusion is what makes me different than salt dissolving in water. If I'm going to be like a hard materialist like I was before
Hmm.
brain surgery, like, yeah, when I die, it's black, it's forever, there's nothingness, no experience. And it's like, okay, but like if I'm just equivalent to a complex version of salt dissolving in water, then when I die, that doesn't change. Like, where's my death point? Because they just cut out a part of my brain and I'm still me.
Right.
So, and when like we're gonna call Jodie's dead when the electricity stops in my brain. What if like if I were able to take out my memories, put them in your brain, take your memories, put them in mine? Who's who?
Right.
I only really know that I'm me because I remember being me yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it
Yeah,
was a
fair
thought of
point.
like, okay, so if I'm gonna run out of material, okay, so maybe if I'm salt dissolving in water, sure, I don't know the answer, but then when I die, it doesn't change. I'm still salt dissolving in water.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm a spirit, then I'm a spirit. Like, then I don't know the rules for that. I tried to get myself scared by thinking, well, yeah, but my spirit dies when I die. It's like, okay, that's a pessimistic view. But the idea is that I'm more willing to believe that I have something more interesting than salt dissolving in water that's guiding me. And an important part of that is when I started having seizures, it was difficult to like feel like I'm myself. And let me describe that. So
Mm.
imagine an Olympic track runner gets into like an accident and now they're quadriplegic.
Right.
And it's like, oh, I'm this incredible athlete stuck in a broken body. And they're just, and a lot of people can imagine this like head stuck in a broken body.
Mm-hmm.
Terrifying. But
It
like,
happens. Yeah, I've
yeah,
known people
yeah,
that they've gotten into terrible car wrecks, and sort of the worst aspect of it is they end up with some intense debility. But I mean, they remember what they were able to do, and they have that sense of loss of
right.
I was capable of this, but now, unfortunately, like this is the boat I'm in. Yeah.
Right. And that's exactly what happened after I had my first set of seizures. I went from someone who never needed a calendar, never needed to write anything, like almost didn't need to write anything down.
Mhm.
Always had really, really sharp memory, and I was doing very well in school without really trying. All of a sudden, I'm forgetting that I even have tests on certain days and cutting class because I always did just whatever. I'll take the test, get 100. But I forgot there was a test. And then I'm having trouble remembering things that people just said to me. And I'm feeling like like a person inside a broken brain. This idea that this brain is this instrument that I'm trying to work, much like we imagine the brain controlling the body, this puppeteer of the body that's the brain. I'm trying to puppeteer my brain and it's broken.
Right.
So again, that gave me a separation of the self and the brain to some degree, because I identified with the abilities and personality traits that I was starting to lose or change. It's kind of when I tell people about this, I ask them like, what's the smallest thing, what's the smallest aspect of who you are as a person that could change, and that would mean that you're not you anymore?
Right.
If you woke up tomorrow and you hated something that you love right now, would that mean that you're not you? If you woke up tomorrow and all of a sudden you're really like mean to people and what would I have to change in your head to make you not you anymore?
Right. And it's interesting because a lot of it sounds very theoretical, but I feel like in this day and age it's really not, because we're able to sort of dissect and divvy up human beings in ways that we never really happened in the past. Things like, the heart was once considered sort of the source of human animacy. But I mean, you can have heart transplants now. You
Yeah,
can lose that. Some people think that we can even maybe do full on head transplants at some
yeah.
point in the future. If that's true, I mean, your brain seems pretty important to who you are, your face. It's interesting. And I think it's very relevant. I don't think it's a bunch of like silly thought experiments to be posing to people. It's like, what are you? And no one really knows. No one knows.
Right. And I think what that really calls to the ship of Theseus, which I assume you're familiar of.
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I was talking about this to my girlfriend just the other day. It's like, okay, so I took out my right temporal lobe, I feel fine. Other people take out other parts, they feel fine. So if we just kept swapping, when does one person become the other? And it's like, okay, a lot of it's in the prefrontal cortex. A lot of what makes people are in the unique parts of our brain that are especially developed. But it's kind of curious, like, okay, now we're saying that like we as a person exist right here.
Hmm.
Um, There a neuropsychiatrist friend of mine talks about how like there are certain people who grow up with like very rigid like authoritarian ideologies, and they get an injury in the frontal lobe or something, and they like suddenly they're a socialist.
Mm,
So like that's a
interesting.
pretty big part of someone's personality that was able to be changed with brain injury.
Hmm. Hmm.
And those kinds of things happen in the other direction more often, where someone who was a relatively normal person becomes especially aggressive after a brain injury. Did not happen to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I guess after that surgery happens, it would be hard to discount the brain as being sort of the bedrock of experience. I am curious. You said that there was a show you watched that referenced a single cell sort of perpetuating life. Was that Annihilation?
I think so. Holy
Okay.
shit. Yeah, you remembered it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the
Okay.
one with the invisible stuff that they walk into and they're trying to talk to people, talk to the
Right.
aliens with
Yeah.
the
The
letters, and it turns out, yeah.
Oh, so that one, the one where there's like the levitating ink splotches,
Yeah.
that one is called Arrival.
Oh, okay. That one then. Yes.
Right. Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Wow, I'm glad that you were able. I haven't forgotten that name, and I keep thinking I'll look it up, but I never do.
Yeah. Well,
Arrival.
it's really
Yeah.
bizarre. I could have sworn that I had read you referenced that, and then I tried to find it and I couldn't. So I was like, that's weird. So,
Well, you got it. Arrival. Yeah, the levitating ink splotches. Yeah,
mhm.
that one references life starting as a single cell, and I saw that less than a week after brain surgery. So I was like,
Yeah.
not something new to me. Something I had considered my own core knowledge since third grade, but like
Hmm.
some
Right.
reason seeing that triggered the thought of like, why? Actually, an important thing that I didn't bring up is like I'm this collection of individual cells. What makes me different than all cells as a single entity? Like,
Mhm.
what makes my right? Am I like if my right hand a separate being than my left foot any more than I'm a separate being than you? Like, it. I couldn't find like solid, hard, materialist answers to those questions. Like, a friend of mine referenced a book that I haven't read, but I like the title of it is When Breath Becomes Air.
Mm.
And it's a good idea of like where's the end of my being.
Right.
And the important thing for me, as I said though, is not having the answers, but understanding that no matter the answer, the question is really the compelling thought. Is like there's nothing.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And I read some of your thoughts about that, and I think they're all very relevant. Like when the first cell sort of split apart, where is there truly a boundary between us and the rest of being or whatever it is? And that is one of the hard questions that, as tempting as like hard materialism is, it's it's a bit difficult because if everything really is just atoms, what seems to make us animate and other things not that way.
Right, right. And I mean, as you probably, if you read my writing, geez, like our definition of like it has to have a cell in order to be smart, it has to have a brain is like that is so arbitrary and just like given how little we understand of our own brains, where
Mm.
it's like, okay, these electrical patterns, that's probably the consciousness because when we break it, it doesn't work. It's like, okay, but that's not really understanding at all. There's a prominent neurosurgeon, I can't remember his name right now, but I like the quote that he deals with people with more severe traumatic brain injuries than I, and he talks about how the brain is the instrument by which the spirit controls the body. I found that an eloquent way of describing my experience, even though I don't necessarily identify as spirit being anything in particular. The idea that myself trying to control this broken brain instrument and really experiencing that.
Hmm. Well, have you ever heard of panpsychism by chance?
No, never.
Yeah, you might be interested in it. It's something I don't know if I buy it necessarily, but it's a nice and interesting thought. Can't really be proven, but it basically posits that consciousness, not intelligence necessarily, but consciousness is a just fundamental element that like everything has. The complication with that is that if everything is conscious, whatever that looks like, why is our consciousness seemingly divided from a plank of wood's
Right.
consciousness?
Yeah,
But
and then
it's something
what is a thing?
right. Yeah. I guess that still assumes there's some level of organization that creates a boundary, so, even if it's sort of like a permeable boundary.
Yeah.
But that's something to look into. That's along the lines of probably dualism, and maybe a little bit along the lines of reincarnation, a little bit.
Yeah, I'd much like the idea that a rock has consciousness, and then I cut the rock in half. There's two rocks with two consciousnesses. I don't know about that.
Hmm.
Like it's like we kind of have some sort of, like, if you stay solely within materialistic ideas, you kind of have to assume there's one, like a lot of people have, like we're all one energy or whatever, and I don't like that. I do like because I do have this individuality to me.
Right.
Um, and if I were to be reshuffled, I wouldn't, like, that's not me.
Hmm.
Similarly, like if I woke up with your memories, like how would I know that I'm, like, what's going on at all? So I kind of define who I am based on my experiences, right? And that's it. Is this I like to call that the temporal being, my own little craft. Just the summation of your experiences combined with whatever you want to call who you are. That's the self, in the sense that if any of that were to significantly change, you wouldn't recognize yourself. So that's kind of who you are, and there's no physical manifestation of it. It's just your sort of four-dimensional trip through time.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying, and I mean, you said you had some of these really impactful experiences shortly after surgery. Coming out of surgery, what was it like for you? Mentally, physically. I know you said you felt sort of trapped in a mind, or like with a brain that didn't quite feel like what you were accustomed to.
Yeah, actually, no, that started before surgery, because the seizures were disrupting my brain so significantly that I still identify as a very smart person, but I identified as, like, superbly capable of anything that my mind was put to, and it never kind of met a challenge I couldn't overcome until after epilepsy. I finally needed a tutor. I was, like, not doing well in a class, even though I was trying.
Right.
Um, but the actually after surgery, what's interesting is, like, I was struggling with actually some semblance of that fear of death. I brought myself all the way to the idea of, like, okay, so if I reincarnate, or if I end up with my current body to be immortal, eventually the universe is gonna either go contract or expand and heat death, whatever. I'm still gonna die one day, and I was still upset about that. But that was when I was on dexamethasone, famously known for making Trump crazy.
Oh.
While he was taking it, and I was like, I know what he feels right now as he's tweeting up a storm. I know that feeling.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Just like racing thoughts, racing irrational thoughts.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of that manic up and down, where
Right.
there are moments where I was like, literally a day after brain surgery, I was like, I can go for a marathon. Like, I could run right now. I could run. Oh,
Uh-huh.
I feel so good. And then the next day, I'm gonna die. And
Yeah.
and even if I don't die, the universe is gonna die, because then I'll die, die. And but, like, that all smoothed out over the next 2 weeks, and that's when I realized I wasn't afraid of things anymore.
Hmm. So you do identify with a loss of fear after your surgery?
Yes, but it's hard to define. Like, a lot of people say, like, I'm afraid that someone will say, like, something like, "Oh, I'm scared that I hurt you. I'm scared to say something." Um, it's a very particular, like, animalistic self-harm avoidance fear that is removed. Um,
Like an immediate
and
danger thing, like a danger to yourself?
Yeah. I mean, there's one situation that I was in where I would have felt this when I was walking through a bad neighborhood, and someone, like, calls over four guys, and they surround me, and they're like, "What's up?" And I've been through the Bronx before. I've been mugged and got punched in it. That was in high school, but I would have, like, been a little startled and take a stutter step. And the right decision in that situation is to keep moving. So I saw them coming, and I was like, okay, keep moving. But, like, I didn't feel any fear of these, like, four big guys that were, like, trying to be intimidating. And I was, like, congratulating myself for keeping cool, but like, I was like, wait a second.
Hmm.
No, there wasn't a second. And, like, leaning, other situations where you might feel that just fight or flight feeling where someone almost hits you with their car,
Right.
or
I was just thinking about that, like a
yeah,
car coming at you, as opposed to, oh, you know what? Maybe it can be anything. Maybe I didn't say the right thing at the dinner party
right,
or something like that. Maybe the more social, complex, and maybe it's more like anxiety than fear, really.
right.
Right.
Hindsight's still a thing. I can still, like, I still feel like, oh man, I screwed that up, regret, and like I'm able to have negative emotions towards worries like about the future, but it's not quite the same as that person might kill me feeling. It's a very,
Hmm.
I try to say that they're different brands of feelings. They're
Yeah.
often interchanged, but if you really analyze it tightly, those are different feelings. And my experience, though, is it's odd. That same part of the brain does speech inhibition. So that social anxiety, like, I wouldn't have described myself as like anxious in social situations, but I was certainly, I wasn't especially interested in talking to strangers, that like didn't, yeah, if they had no special thing to interest me, I just wouldn't
Yeah.
interact. But now I'm just a lot more outgoing, a lot more talkative, a lot more interested in speaking to people who I don't really care about.
Hmm.
So like I was always a confident, or no, it wasn't always, but leading up to the surgery, I was a confident person interested in engaging. But like removing speech inhibition really got me going.
Yeah. That's interesting. Is there an actual identifiable aspect to it, like within your physiology? Like, was there a part of your brain that was removed that is like quote unquote the center of this type of fear,
Yeah.
this brand of fear?
Yeah. So the right amygdala is primary driver of harm avoidance, and physical response to negative stimuli and speech inhibition. Those are the three primary things, as opposed to the left amygdala, which is more of a thoughtful response to emotional stimuli. And um, theoretically, if you think about the average like masculine guy gets angry and he punches a wall because something bad happened. That's his right amygdala going crazy. Um, Never did that. I always was a relatively. I grew up relatively on the feminine side of the emotional spectrum in terms of like gender normative associations.
Hmm.
Um, so when I found out that the gender lateralization of the amygdala is males and conservatives have larger and more active right amygdala, more focused on harm avoidance and physical responses, and women and liberals have the opposite, where they're more likely to have a thoughtful response and more likely to. There's association with the left amygdala and empathy, which I certainly experienced an increase in empathy
Oh,
after having.
it's on the left and right side
Mm-hmm.
correspondingly that
Oh yeah,
conservatives feel. That's
yeah,
funny.
yeah. Literally left. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And if you think about, the liberals also have more active anterior cingulate cortex, which is error avoidance, which I found fascinating because you have like error avoidance, political correctness, harm avoidance, like
Right. I was just
keep
thinking
the
that.
other
Yeah.
away. But yeah, so I mean, I guess I should go over what the parts that I had removed, and what they did.
Yeah.
So I mentioned the right amygdala, also had the right hippocampus removed. That just generally does episodic memory, like and also just generally like facts. This happened. You were there. I did this. Those very like, I think they're called semantic memories, but the specific facts that actually are facts.
Right.
Uh, and both hippocampus store those memories, but generally the side that it is on correlates to which hemisphere's memories are there. Um, so it's important because the right hemisphere's temporal lobe does facial recognition, um, and I had the front half cut out, which doesn't doesn't imply that I lost any particular thing. I guess I I did lose some ability to recognize faces, some ability, like very, very slightly lowered ability to recognize faces and objects as quickly as someone who hadn't had surgery might. It's
Right.
funny, like if you see like this happened actually a few times where driving for whatever reason see something brown, I think it's a rock, it's a cow, or I looking for, I think lots of people experience looking for something, not recognizing it's right in front of you. Just happened a bit more after surgery.
Right. Yeah, I was reading recently about there's definitely a condition where and I'm not sure if this is specifically what you're experiencing, but there is just physically in the brain a place where we have recognition of objects basically.
That's the
And
right temporal lobe. Yeah.
right, yeah, and some people
Yeah.
it's hard for me to like imagine, but I'm sure it totally makes sense when thinking about the brain.
Well, so people who have their entire right temporal lobe removed. So we're, again, when I say right temporal lobe, talking about neurotypical right-handed person, generally have these associations. Left-handed people, it's generally reversed. So right-handed person speaks out of their left temporal lobe and recognizes faces with their right temporal lobe. So an important part of that is cutting out the entire right temporal lobe. There are people who have done that and they can't recognize their parents, anyone, until they like do something that identifies them. Like the left temporal lobe can kind of logically deduce who someone is. This is a person who is talking to me like this, looks about this tall with this hair, and like, this is. So I saw a really good example of the difference here. If you like imagine the outline of a butterfly with no image whatsoever, just the outline, kind of the left temporal lobe can just kind of figure out that that's a butterfly, but just kind of in context, like if it's sitting on a leaf especially, like kind of put it together. The right is like butterfly instantly, just doesn't need the logical thought of comparing it to other things, instantly remembers that's a thing.
Right. I've heard of, I think it's called Capgras syndrome, where uh, people they can't quite recognize members. They can recognize members of their family, but they believe that there's some sort of like imposter. But on like the phone or things like that, they'll recognize this voice as being like the respective voice of their family.
Huh,
I,
I have never heard
I
of that.
think it's called Capgras syndrome. Capgras syndrome is something to people listening, but that definitely does happen. The situation where like seeing the face doesn't trigger that associative response, but just voice alone can convince these people that they're hearing their loved ones or their parents.
That is interesting because in the first time that I saw my mom about after not seeing her for 4 days, shortly after brain surgery, and like I didn't think she wasn't her when she showed up, but I was like, is that really like something that I should recognize instantly in a place she didn't like? But it was like the feeling of seeing someone with a drastically different hairstyle or someone you haven't seen in a while, of like, oh, that's you.
Right.
Like that feeling to someone I saw 4 days ago. And I could imagine if someone was a bit closer to like the schizophrenic side of things to be like, that's not really my mom, is it?
Mhm.
I could see that having had my experience, which is kind of crazy to me because that sounds super terrifying.
Yeah. Well, at a sort of bird's eye view, I mean, this experience definitely sounds very life altering. But I mean, do you feel like it's a net positive or a net negative force, or is it just sort of impossible to say one or the other?
Well, obviously glad I don't have seizures anymore. So that's obviously not positive reason I made the decision.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that the obvious I would say removing the fear and the speech inhibition net positive. Like the personality changes, or the overall capability changes. If I could have my memory back, that would be great. I would love to have fantastic memory again. I've gotten into some trouble. I don't know if you saw what I wrote about that. Did you?
Oh no, not
Uh,
specifically. What happened there?
okay. It was so with I was dating a particularly jealous girl,
Oh no.
and I was convinced that something I did with a girl that she was especially jealous of. I was convinced that I did that with my girlfriend at the time.
Ooh.
And I was like, no, we went to that park together. We went to that park together. I'm sure we did. And then like it was weird. We broke up and whatever like 3 times, but it's another time I thought I remembered doing something that I did like sexually with another girl. I remember
Oh.
doing that with this jealous girl. And I was like, I said, like, remember when we did that? She's like, that wasn't with me. I was like,
Uh.
oh man, like that never, like that is so far beyond, like, I would remember not like before having epilepsy, I would remember the day that all of those things happened and what was said after, not like forgetting who I was with. The two girls look similar, really similar, but like,
But
yeah,
you would still know it, without the surgery, you would definitely know.
yeah. And I really suspect the idea it's very focused on who did what at the time. And I suspect the right temporal lobe for that and not having that sort of encoding going on into the right hippocampus, the easy pathway. Um, Oh, and side note, also the right amygdala both amygdala play a role in the modulation of how powerful a memory should be.
Hmm.
So one way to make sure that you remember things you care about, right? Like if you really care, you remember.
Yeah.
That used to be true for me, but it really has been less true for me now. And it's been frustrating because when I meet someone new and I forget something important that they said, they think that I don't care about them as much as I do,
Mhm.
or something like that. And that's definitely life altering. But the other negatives are like beyond the memory problem. I certainly take this surgery. I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
It's frustrating because there's like, and I think in a few years they'll be able to do this surgery without removing the hippocampus, but which would have kept my memory a bit more intact. But yeah, I still think that overall I'm a better person now than I was going into surgery. But who's to say that it was necessarily the surgery that did that? A lot of people go through extreme experiences, come out, I don't know, more empathetic and more.
Right. Yeah, I get you. Are you still like jumping out of planes? Are you doing any crazier things now that you don't feel that sort of primal, like animalistic fear of death?
I mean, again, I was always doing that.
Right.
I'm not capable. I'm not legally allowed to fly the airplanes that I used to fly. I'm still considering flying, but it seems like a bad choice
Hmm.
for my own well-being. So, like, I have no desire to be any more risky than I was. If anything, I'm actually consciously more cautious about big like things because I feel like I have a good thing going and I don't want to have a seizure. I don't like, if I died tomorrow, what's the whole point of going through all this, right? I could have just not done any of the things that I did. So I'm still intently avoiding death about as much as I was before in terms of circumstance, but I am kind of treating myself a bit like a science experiment. I'll lean over a cliff a little bit too much that it would have bothered me before. Um, I would say really the only presentation is of being more fearless, I guess, is that I actually have to. And the opposite is happening, where I'm like, I'm not gonna take care of myself, so I need to think more about these decisions that will probably hurt me.
Hmm.
So yeah, if anything, I'm trying to overcorrect in the other direction in a lot of cases.
Right. You're sort of fighting back against those changes that you've experienced.
Right. It's almost like the rest of my fear was a sort of balance, and now I don't have it, so it's like, oh, I might just walk off a cliff and not realize. Like that's not real. That's an exaggeration, but the idea is like I'll get myself into bad situations quite easily if I don't think about it.
Yeah, I get you. Before we sort of wrap things up, I know you don't want to become a pop culture icon, but are there any sort of plugs that you want to give people? Anything specifically? Is that work that you've written? Is that going to be a book or something? That's
Oh
what I was
man,
wondering. It should
yeah.
be. It should be. You should go for it.
A lot of people tell me to write a book based on that. They're like, this is the base plate for a book. Write a book on this. I feel it's funny. I don't have. A lot of people would say that I have a big ego, and I'd probably agree. But the funny thing is that I feel like writing something about philosophy sounds a little bit too like, who am I to tell everyone that like how it is? I don't know. My opinion is that no one knows. But here's what works for me. I'm tempted, but I don't think that's anytime soon. I've got enough on my plate. In terms of plugs, I mean, there's nothing that I'm doing that needs a plug. I could ask if my buddies at the Brain Bar want a plug. They do organize events. Now they're on Zoom, but they used to be in New York City, and they will be once things are open again. The Brain Bar is like a series of salons that discuss interesting topics about the brain, usually surrounding a theme. There was just one yesterday about it was kind of a little fun Halloween. It wasn't really spooky, but it was kind of a fun Halloween special where they go over. They have a neuroscientist come on who works with actually dreams and was able to influence dreams using like smells and kind of target people into certain dreams.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I felt a lot of impact from that was if in one of his experiments you're able to get someone to like learn something in the day, like some facts, then they sleep and you quietly play the set of facts on a track. And the
Right.
people who heard it while they were sleeping remember it better than the people who didn't. And I was like, this is learning in their sleep? That's crazy.
Yeah, I've heard that, and to me, it was always sort of a rumor because my brother in high school would say, "Oh, I've recorded this history book, and I'm just going to play it while I sleep." I was like, I don't know about that, but that's fascinating. That's very interesting.
Right. I would have thought that if he wasn't a neuroscientist, I would have been like, yeah, okay, I see out Dexter's lab too. Omelette du fromage, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, if you ever get to writing or publish something, let me know, and we should definitely discuss it. Because, well, I mean, yes, it is you discussing philosophy, but I can't really think of anyone else who's closer to this sort of stuff. I mean, it's very relevant to you, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I don't think it's pompous to be like, oh, here's my theory of the mind. Well, you're living through something that truly makes you question the nature of the mind. It's your life,
Yeah.
you know?